Well, thanks very much. I'd just like to say what a pleasure it is for Jade Software to again sponsor the Downstream Conference Dinner. It's important to us, and I'd also like to take the opportunity to launch onto the New Zealand market 200 renewable energy distributed generation plants, and you should find your personal one in front of you. On a personal note, I'd also like to say what a pleasure it is to be back, to have the chance to say a few more words. Some of you may remember last year I spoke a little about creative innovation. And innovation certainly hasn't gone away. Innovation is still a very, very hot topic, which is good. This afternoon, for example, Graham Peters, Electricity Networks Association, told us how they'd surveyed their 26 member organisations, and the number one thing that came back, the number one thing that those organisations are looking for is innovation. Dr. Brent Layton, Electricity Authority, one of the main aims of the authority is to create a level playing field so that participants, and in fact new entrants, can innovate and develop and deliver new technology into the market, which the authority sees as in the best long-term interests of the consumer. You also mentioned that companies that are successful at that innovation and delivery will tend to prosper and grow, while the companies that are not successful, not so much. So tonight what I'd like to do fairly quickly is take the opportunity to look back in history so that we can look forwards. And that's quite interesting. And a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, we know that people always tend to overestimate short-term change and tend to underestimate long-term change. The other thing that plays into this is the pace of change is accelerating. We know things are changing faster and faster. So what I'm planning to do is to split time into 50-year chunks. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, most people will live through, God willing, 2 of those chunks to some extent or another. But more importantly, 50 years is long enough to see a decent amount of change. So, for example, if you take me, like personally, I was born around 1960, with some care, a lot more exercise. I have hopes of seeing something like 2050. If you imagine a child born in the year 2000, so turn of the century, they are shortly going to go to university. Now, education is something that's really important to us, something we're quite passionate about. So if you imagine that child going to university in the next year or two, studying maybe, I don't know, engineering or IT, what will we teach them that will still be of use to them in 2050, which is when their career will be peaking? Can you imagine how much is going to change by then? And finally, as an example, imagine a child born today, or born this year at least, in say 2016, so maybe your child, maybe a grandchild. In 2016, on average life expectancy, they will be alive in 2100. Imagine the amazing things they're going to see between now and 2100. And to give you something, think back, imagine if we cast that whole thing back 100 years. So a child born in 1916, middle of the First World War, on the same scale, would live to the year 2000. Think what they would have seen from 1916 to 2000. And the pace of change is accelerating. Your children, your grandchildren will see more, faster. It is amazing what that generation will see. So, 50-year chunks, start off from 2000. Let's go back 3 chunks, which takes us to 1850. Now, I know 1850 to us seems like so long ago. We scoff at 1850 with our iPhones and our space travel and our decaf double soy lattes. But it's not that long ago. Someone born in 1850 could easily have lived to 1930. They could have talked to someone who was 10 who would have lived to 1980. And probably half of us in the room could have talked to someone in 1980. There are people alive today in the US, in the States, who have actually talked to someone Who can remember the Civil War? Civil War was 1865. So it seems like ancient history, but it's not that long ago. It's all connected, man. So in 1850, let's take a quick look. The President of the US was Zachary Taylor. On the English throne was a very youthful Queen Victoria. And in New Zealand, we had George Grey as the governor, because we hadn't got the point of having a Prime Minister yet. The US had a population of 23 million, which, funnily enough, is about the same as Australia today. And only limited states. So the whole middle of the US was just like uncharted territory. There were states on the west coast and the east coast, nothing in the middle. Civil War, of course, was yet to come in 1850. Travel was all by train, but there was a risk of being attacked by Indians. Intercontinental travel, sailing ships. From an electrical point of view, we should all know Edison invented the light bulb in 1879, and the first power stations came up in the late 1800s. So in that chunk of history, you go from pre-Civil War, through to 1900. So 1900, what happened in 1900? Well, you'll have to look it up, but I can tell you. Benjamin Harrison was President of the US. Queen Victoria was still on the throne. And in New Zealand, we had Richard Seddon. So in 1900, you've got early cars. You're just moving out of horseless carriages. There's still plenty of horses around. Even in the First World War, most of the armies were horse-drawn. But early cars, early flights. So the Wright brothers were 1903. Blériot flew the Channel in 2009. If you look at turn of the century harbours, then coal steamships are there, together with sailing ships at a transitional period. You've got radio coming up at the turn of the century. Morse, the Titanic, was one of the first uses of shipborne radio in 1912. In terms of electrification, you start to see some centralised power, some early grids. In that chunk, I guess, from 1900 on, the UK national grid, 1938. And in New Zealand, we had Lake Coleridge in 1914 in that chunk, and some regional grids coming up. So by 1950, now 1950 in my scale is only going back one chunk, and for some people in the room, that's actually well living memory. So President in 1950 was Harry Truman. On the throne was King George VI, and in New Zealand we had Sydney Hollard. And kind of only one chunk back, still most travel was by ship, admittedly, steamships. In aviation, we had military jets, but civil stuff was all propellers. So you had, Korean War F-86 Sabres, but in civilian you had Constellations and Strata Cruisers, which is pretty cool. They're like an early A380 with a two-storey thing. You had radios, but based on valves, gradually moving to transistors and integrated circuits. Black and white movies. It was the start of TV networks. We're only going back one chunk. It was the start of TV networks, but TV was black and white and was basically filmed radio, which is actually ironic because we're sort of going back to that now with Paul Holmes and stuff. And then in New Zealand, we had the national grid, we had the NZED, Cook Strait Cable comes up in that time, ECNZ, Transpower, all in that sort of 1950s chunk. And then we get to the current chunk, so we're 2000. So President of the US was Bill Clinton. On the throne was Elizabeth II. And in New Zealand we had Helen Clark. By now we've got jet travel, so everyone's now flying. The ships have gone. And we've got the internet up. About 50% of the global network traffic in 2000 was carried on the internet. But a lot of the stuff that we think of as kind of core to the internet was only just there or came after 2000. So Google was 98, Wikipedia was 2001, Facebook 2004, the iPhone wasn't until 2007. I mean, no iPhone, how did they even do anything? And we'll throw in as an honorary entrant, the 98 power crisis is 2000. And of course, that was that time when New Zealand moved to the competitive market. So that's kind of how we got to where we are. And if you look at the scale of that change from, even just from 1900 through to 2000, that child born in 1916, that saw everything from, vaudeville going through to jazz, to early rock and roll, to punk, to disco, just what changed in that time? And then we think forwards, what are we going to see? And God, I can't wait to see 2050, and I can't wait for my children and grandchildren to see 2100. So let's have a think about some things that we might see. In 2050, I will say that we will have more or less totally driverless cars. I think there's a lot of things where you just go through a tipping point where there is no kind of gentle evolution, and I think when cars replaced horses, that was pretty much the case, that you went almost overnight from horses everywhere to cars everywhere, and there was very little transition. I think we will see the same thing with driverless cars. I think when we look now and we see what are nascent technologies that look to us like what cars might have looked at to someone standing in the early 1900s, I think driverless cars are clearly something like that. It just makes sense. I think wearables will increasingly become important because I think we'll become too busy and too demanding of stuff now to be bothered fishing things out and dealing with them. I think we want them projected on heads-up displays on our glasses. I think we'll want to be able to access stuff all the time wherever we are and not rely on sort of remote devices. This will become like a fob watch. And we've actually got a nascent technology VR thing on our stand. Come by, have a look. If you haven't played with VR, this is a really interesting chance to look at something in a very early stage of development. I think 3D printing has got real legs, and I know at the moment, again, it's something that looks to us toy-like. We might look at it the way someone would look at an early horseless carriage, but I think there's real opportunity with 3D printing. And not just little plastic toys, but it's about being able to economically produce all sorts of parts that are no longer in production. You can 3D print clothes that it's impossible to sew by hand, and scientists are now starting to 3D print food, which is kind of interesting, but I believe them. We'll have virtual workplaces. I think print is effectively going to be history. I think when we look back, the idea that someone would go into work at night and find interesting things on the internet and print them out and roll them up and then get in a petrol-driven car and go around and throw them onto the front lawns of people that didn't have the internet, we're just like, what were they thinking? You know, in 10 years, we will not believe that used to happen. I think print's gone. I think solar will be there. I think obviously distributed generation. I think battery technology. The one thing I think here is we've got to be careful to distinguish between the concept and the implementation. And if there were some dramatic revolution in battery technology, that would change everything. So just because batteries have sort of a limited capability at the moment, the concept that we can store energy like that, it could change, again, one of those tipping points overnight, and that would be interesting. And I'll just jump quickly ahead to 2100. Now, obviously, it's a little bit hazier when you're trying to forecast out two chunks. But I think one of the things I think that is extraordinarily likely is that we will have abundant energy. So I think anyone involved with energy is going to have to make sure they are absolutely agile, responsive, have a culture of innovation, and if you don't keep up, you are going to be left behind. You are going to be left behind. In terms of problems, I think in 2100 we'll have issues in terms of population. I think there'll be an ageing population because of advances in medical science. There'll be far fewer people dropping off the end as more people are coming in at the start. So that's something we'll have to deal with. I think we'll have embedded hardware carrying on in the AR, VR space. I'll take a punt and say we'll have space colonies in 2100. But it's going to be exciting. It's something that our grandchildren, children even, can really look forward to. I'd really like to thank you again for the chance to speak. If you have the opportunity, do stop by our stand, take a look at the VR, and in the meantime, I'll leave you to get on with your mains. Thank you very much.